In late April 1944, the Lexington Herald newspaper printed a short notice that most readers barely noticed. The article, placed between ads for war bonds and farm equipment, said that Dr. Samuel Potter, a doctor from Frankfort, had been called to a faraway plantation in the tobacco hills of central Kentucky. The request had come through strange channels. A telegram was sent not by the plantation owner himself, but by a worried store owner in the nearby town of Harrodsburg. He had become suspicious about repeated orders for medical supplies without any explanation. This short report would mark the beginning of one of the most disturbing investigations in Kentucky history. Before we dive into the story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss these spine-chilling stories. And after you've subscribed, write in the comments where you're watching from and what brought you here today. Whether this finds you during your morning routine, afternoon break, or late-night deep dive, you're joining thousands of brave souls who choose to face the darkness of our past together. Now, let's continue with the story. Dr. Potter arrived at the Creswell plantation on a humid afternoon when the air hung thick with the promise of rain. The estate, once successful in the decades before the war, now showed signs of deliberate neglect and isolation. The main house, a sprawling building of weathered wood and fading whitewash, sat at the end of a long dirt road that wound through overgrown tobacco fields. Records from the county assessor's office would later show that Amos Creswell had inherited the property from his father in 1928, and in the years since, the plantation had become increasingly cut off from the surrounding community. The fields lay fallow, the workers' quarters stood empty, and the once busy road to the main house had grown narrow with disuse. When Dr. Potter was finally led into the house by Amos Creswell himself, a man in his late 50s with the hardened bearing of someone used to absolute authority, the doctor was led not to a sick room, but to a series of locked rooms in the eastern wing of the house. Behind the first door, he found a young woman, no more than 25 years old, in the final stages of labor. Her condition was alarming, not merely because of the obvious distress she was experiencing, but because of what Dr. Potter observed in the dim light of that locked room. Beside her crude bed lay an infant, perhaps 6 months old, wrapped in stained linens. When the doctor came closer to examine the child, he discovered deformities that immediately troubled his professional judgment. The infant's face had severe asymmetry, with one side of the skull appearing compressed and malformed. The palate was split, creating an opening that extended through the upper lip and into the nasal cavity. As Dr. Potter moved through the house that afternoon, guided by Amos Creswell's terse directions, he discovered 2 more locked rooms. In each, he found young women in various stages of pregnancy, their ages ranging from what appeared to be early 20s to mid-20s. The conditions in which they were kept spoke of long-term confinement. The windows had been nailed shut and covered with heavy fabric. The doors showed evidence of external locks. Personal belongings were sparse, almost non-existent. What struck Dr. Potter most profoundly was the silence of these women, their reluctance to meet his eyes, and the way they flinched when Amos Creswell entered their rooms. In his 30 years of medical practice, the doctor had encountered many difficult situations, but nothing had prepared him for what he was beginning to understand about the Creswell plantation. The Creswell family had arrived in central Kentucky in the 1890s, part of a wave of ambitious men seeking to establish themselves in the burgeoning tobacco trade. Amos Creswell's father, Jeremiah, had purchased the land with money earned from years of working as an overseer on larger plantations across the state. County records preserved in the Mercer County Historical Society show that Jeremiah Creswell was known as a shrewd businessman. Though not particularly well-liked among his neighbors, he built the main house in 1896, a structure designed to project authority and permanence in a region where many farming operations remained modest and uncertain. Amos was born in 1900, the only son among 4 children. His childhood, according to scattered references in local church records and school documents, was marked by his father's rigid expectations and his mother's early death from tuberculosis in 1906. Jeremiah raised his children with an iron hand, particularly Amos, whom he groomed to inherit the plantation. The boy showed aptitude for the business aspects of tobacco farming, though neighbors would later recall that he possessed little of the social grace that typically helped plantation owners maintain good relations with the community. He was described in one letter preserved in a collection of correspondence at the Kentucky Historical Society as competent but cold, a young man who seemed to view every interaction as a transaction. In 1918, at the age of 18, Amos married Parthenia Colbert, the daughter of a struggling farmer from a neighboring county. The marriage, arranged through family connections, brought Parthenia into a world of relative prosperity, but also profound isolation. She was 16 at the time of the wedding, a detail recorded in the marriage certificate filed with the county clerk. Her letters to her sister, discovered decades later in an attic trunk, reveal a young woman who initially felt grateful for the security the Creswell name provided, but who quickly came to understand the loneliness that came with being Amos's wife. The couple's first daughter, Verity, was born in 1919. Temperance followed in 1921, and Mercy arrived in 1923. Birth records from the period show that all three girls were delivered at home by the same midwife who had assisted with births on the plantation for years. Parthenia's letters from this period described the joy she found in motherhood, but also hinted at growing concerns about her husband's temperament. She wrote to her sister in 1925 about Amos's increasing distance from her and his peculiar attention to detail regarding the girls' upbringing. He insisted on controlling every aspect of their education, their clothing, their interactions with others. When Parthenia suggested sending the girls to school in town, Amos refused, hiring a series of tutors instead, each of whom stayed only briefly before leaving without explanation. Jeremiah Creswell died in 1928, leaving the plantation entirely to Amos. What followed was a gradual but deliberate withdrawal from the community. Amos dismissed most of the workers, keeping only a handful of men to maintain the most essential operations. He stopped attending church services, a notable absence in a community where Sunday worship was a cornerstone of social life. The few visitors who came to the plantation during the 1930s reported an atmosphere of oppressive silence, a household where the daughters were rarely seen, and Parthenia seemed diminished, her earlier vitality replaced by a nervous quietness that troubled those who remembered her as a girl. By the late 1930s, the Creswell plantation had become a place that neighbors passed without stopping, a property that seemed to exist outside the normal rhythms of rural Kentucky life. Parthenia Colbert Creswell kept a diary from the time she was 12 years old, a habit instilled by her mother, who believed that a woman's thoughts deserved preservation, even if the world around her dismissed them. The diary, a series of cloth-bound journals spanning more than 2 decades, was discovered in 1944 beneath a loose floorboard in what had been Parthenia's sewing room. The entries from her early married years reveal a woman trying to find contentment in her circumstances, documenting small domestic victories and the milestones of her daughter's childhoods. But the tone shifts dramatically beginning in 1938, when Verity turned 19 and began to mature into womanhood. The first troubling entry appears in March of 1938. Parthenia wrote about finding Amos in Verity's room late one evening, long after the girl had gone to sleep. When she questioned him about it, he claimed he had been checking to ensure the window was properly latched against the cold. The explanation seemed plausible enough, but Parthenia noted that she found it strange he would perform such a task at nearly midnight. Over the following weeks, she documented similar incidents. Amos would find reasons to be alone with Verity, asking her to help him with paperwork in his study or requesting her assistance with tasks that Parthenia felt were inappropriate for a daughter to perform for her father. By the summer of that year, Parthenia's concerns had grown into something approaching dread. She wrote of observing Amos watching his daughters with an intensity that disturbed her, particularly when they were unaware of his attention. She noted that he had begun insisting the girls wear specific clothing, dresses he selected himself that Parthenia felt were too mature and revealing for young women living in the isolation of a rural plantation. When she objected, Amos's response was cold and absolute. He reminded her that he provided everything for the family, that his judgment in all matters was final, and that she would do well to remember her place. In September of 1938, Parthenia made her first attempt to send Verity away. She wrote to her sister asking if Verity might come to stay for an extended visit, perhaps to help with her sister's growing family. The letter, preserved among the sister's papers, reveals Parthenia's careful phrasing, her attempt to request help without stating outright what she feared. Amos discovered the correspondence before it could be sent. The diary entry that follows describes a confrontation that left Parthenia shaken. Amos did not raise his voice or strike her, but his words carried a threat that needed no physical violence to reinforce it. He told her that the girls would never leave the plantation, that they belonged to him as surely as the land and the house, and that any further attempts to separate his family would be met with consequences she would regret. The entries from 1939 paint a picture of a woman trapped between maternal instinct and fear for her own safety. Parthenia documented instances that, while never explicitly described, suggest Amos's behavior toward the girls was crossing boundaries that no father should breach. She wrote of finding Verity crying in her room, of the girl's reluctance to be alone with her father, of the way all three daughters had grown silent and withdrawn. In one particularly anguished entry from July of 1939, Parthenia wrote that she had confronted Amos directly, accusing him of having improper intentions toward their daughters. His response terrified her. He smiled, she wrote, a cold expression that never reached his eyes, and asked her what she imagined she could do about her suspicions. Who would believe her accusations against a respected property owner? What proof does she possess? The final entries from early 1940 reveal a woman who had resigned herself to a horrifying reality, but was still searching desperately for a way to protect her daughters. She wrote of feeling ill, of persistent stomach pains and episodes of weakness that she attributed to the stress of her situation. In one of her last entries, dated September of 1940, just weeks before her death, Parthenia wrote that she intended to visit the county clerk's office in town to leave a record of her fears in case something should happen to her. On the morning of October 15, 1940, Parthenia Creswell was found dead in her bed by her daughter, Temperance. The official record filed with the Mercer County Coroner's Office lists the cause of death as heart failure, a conclusion reached after only the most cursory examination. Dr. Edwin Marsh, the county coroner at the time, had been practicing medicine for nearly 40 years, and his approach to death certificates reflected the attitudes of rural Kentucky in that era, when a woman of 44 died in her sleep with no obvious signs of violence, and when her husband reported that she had been complaining of feeling unwell for several months. Heart failure seemed a reasonable enough explanation. The funeral was held 3 days later at the small Methodist church that the Creswell family had once attended regularly. Attendance was sparse, a reflection of how thoroughly Amos had isolated his family from the community over the preceding years. The minister who presided over the service, Reverend Thomas Blackwell, noted in his personal journal that the daughters appeared strangely subdued, even for young women grieving their mother. They stood together during the service, dressed in identical black dresses that appeared to have been made from the same bolt of fabric, their eyes fixed on the ground. Amos remained composed throughout, accepting condolences with brief nods and few words. What drew little attention at the time, but would later become significant, was the speed with which Parthenia was buried. Most families in the region observed a period of viewing, allowing friends and more distant relatives time to pay their respects. Amos declined all offers to host visitors at the plantation, insisting that his wife be laid to rest with minimal ceremony. She was interred in the family cemetery on the plantation grounds, a small plot surrounded by an iron fence where Amos's parents and grandparents had been buried. The grave was marked with a simple stone bearing her name and the dates of her birth and death. In the weeks following Parthenia's funeral, several members of the community made attempts to call on the Creswell daughters, a customary gesture of support for a family in mourning. Each visitor was turned away at the door by Amos, who explained that his daughters were too distraught to receive company. Mrs. Helen Pritchard, a neighbor who had known Parthenia since her marriage to Amos, arrived one afternoon with a basket of preserves and bread. She later told the county sheriff that Amos had accepted the basket but refused to let her enter the house. Through a window, she glimpsed one of the daughters, though she could not determine which one, standing in the hallway. The young woman appeared to be watching the exchange, her face pale and expression unreadable. The county clerk's office received an unusual visitor in late October of 1940. Amos Creswell appeared to file paperwork related to his wife's estate, a routine matter that nonetheless struck the clerk, a man named Robert Finch, as oddly rushed. Finch, who maintained meticulous records and had a memory for detail that would later prove valuable, recalled that Amos seemed particularly interested in ensuring that all of Parthenia's personal effects were legally transferred to his sole possession. When Finch asked if the daughters might inherit any of their mother's belongings, Amos responded that everything in the household belonged to him and that his daughters had no need of separate property. What no one knew at the time was that Parthenia had indeed visited the county clerk's office several weeks before her death. She had come alone, a rare occurrence given Amos's habit of accompanying her on the infrequent occasions when she traveled to town. She had requested a private moment with Finch and had given him a sealed envelope with instructions that it should only be opened in the event of her death under circumstances that seemed suspicious or unexplained. Finch, somewhat puzzled by the request but respecting the obvious distress of the woman before him, had placed the envelope in a locked drawer and made a notation in his private records. After Parthenia's death was ruled natural causes and her burial proceeded without incident, Finch assumed the envelope's contents were simply the anxious writings of a woman in poor health. The envelope remained sealed and forgotten in that drawer for nearly 4 years. The months following Parthenia's death brought changes to the Creswell plantation that, while noticed by the community, were explained away with such careful deliberation that few thought to question them. Amos Creswell had always been a man who planned meticulously, and the isolation of his daughters required more than locked doors and high walls. It demanded a network of carefully constructed lies, each one reinforced by the cooperation of men who valued their business relationships more than their curiosity. The first person Amos approached was Thomas Rigby, the postmaster in Harrodsburg. Rigby operated from a small office on Main Street, a position that gave him knowledge of nearly every correspondence that flowed in and out of the county. In early November of 1940, just weeks after Parthenia's burial, Amos arrived at the post office with a proposal. He explained that his daughters, devastated by their mother's death, had decided to attend a finishing school in Charlottesville, Virginia, an institution that would provide them with the refinement and education appropriate to young women of their standing. The girls would be away for an extended period, perhaps several years, and during that time, Amos would need Rigby's assistance in managing their correspondence. What Amos offered in exchange was substantial. He would pay Rigby a monthly sum, enough to supplement the postmaster's modest salary significantly, and in return, Rigby would handle all inquiries about the Creswell daughters with a consistent story. He would accept letters addressed to the girls and hold them for Amos to collect. He would assure anyone who asked that he had personally processed mail from the daughters, letters describing their studies and their life in Virginia. Records from the Harrodsburg post office, examined years later, show a series of envelopes postmarked from Charlottesville and addressed to various townspeople, all in handwriting that analysis would eventually prove had been forged by Amos himself. The second conspirator was less willing but equally necessary. Deacon Marcus Webb of the Methodist Church had known the Creswell family for years and had presided over the baptisms of all 3 daughters. He was a man who prided himself on his moral standing in the community, which made his cooperation all the more remarkable. Amos approached him in December of 1940 with a request cloaked in paternal concern. He explained that his daughters needed time away from the painful memories of their mother's death, that the finishing school in Virginia would provide them with opportunities they could never have in rural Kentucky. When members of the congregation asked about the girls, as they inevitably would, Deacon Webb could assure them that the daughters were thriving in their new environment, that he had received personal correspondence from them describing their coursework and their gratitude for their father's sacrifice in sending them away. What Amos offered Deacon Webb was not money but something the man valued more, a generous donation to the church building fund, enough to repair the leaking roof and replace the worn pews that had troubled the congregation for years. The deacon accepted, and from that point forward, he became one of the most effective voices in spreading the fiction of the daughter's absence. He spoke warmly of letters he claimed to have received. He praised Amos's dedication to his daughter's futures, and he gently redirected any questions that probed too deeply into the specifics of their situation. The merchants of Harrodsburg played their parts as well, though most were unaware they were participating in a deception. Amos continued to purchase supplies as he always had, but the nature of his orders began to change in ways that only careful examination would later reveal. He bought fabric in quantities and styles suitable for young women. He ordered books and writing materials. He purchased medicines and tonics that suggested ongoing domestic life. When the owner of the general store, a man named Porter, commented on the variety of goods Amos was acquiring for a household of 1, Amos explained that he was sending packages to his daughters regularly, that a father's duty did not end simply because his children were studying away from home. The most elaborate part of Amos's deception involved the creation of physical evidence to support his claims. He hired a woman from a neighboring county, someone unfamiliar with the Creswell family, to write letters in a feminine hand based on drafts he provided. These letters, supposedly from Verity, Temperance, and Mercy, described life at the fictional finishing school in detail. They mentioned classes in literature and music, afternoon teas with other students, and gratitude for their father's generosity. Amos would then travel to Lexington, where he had arrangements with a contact who would forward the letters from Virginia, ensuring they bore the proper postmarks. He kept copies of these letters in a leather portfolio, ready to show anyone who expressed excessive interest in his daughter's welfare. Telegraph records from the Western Union office in Harrodsburg show a pattern of messages that, in retrospect, reveals the depth of Amos's planning. He would send telegrams addressed to himself, supposedly from his daughters, brief messages expressing affection and requesting small items be sent to them. The telegraph operator, a young man named Stevens, processed these messages without suspicion, unaware that Amos had composed both sides of each exchange. The pattern continued month after month, a paper trail of fabricated communication that would have been convincing to anyone who did not look too closely at the details. The winter of 1942 arrived early in central Kentucky, bringing with it ice storms that coated the bare trees and made the roads nearly impassable. It was during one of these storms in late January that a midwife named Ada Birch received an urgent summons to a farmhouse in Harrison County, some 30 miles from the Creswell plantation. The message had come through a traveling merchant who claimed a family needed immediate assistance with a difficult birth. The fee offered was substantial, enough to make the journey worthwhile despite the dangerous conditions. Ada Birch had been delivering babies in rural Kentucky for more than 20 years. She had learned the trade from her mother and grandmother before her, and she prided herself on having seen nearly every complication that could arise during childbirth. But what she encountered at that isolated farmhouse would trouble her for the rest of her life. The woman in labor was young, perhaps 22 or 23, and she was attended by an older man who identified himself only as her uncle. The birth itself was difficult but not unusual, and Ada performed her duties with the professional competence that had earned her reputation throughout the region. What disturbed Ada was the infant itself. The child, a girl, was born with abnormalities that Ada recognized immediately as severe. The skull was misshapen, compressed on one side in a way that suggested problems with the bone structure. The spine curved unnaturally, creating a hump at the base of the neck. One leg was visibly shorter than the other, and the feet were twisted inward at angles that would make walking impossible without intervention. But most troubling were the facial deformities. The palate was completely clefted, extending through the upper lip and into the nasal cavity. The eyes were set at slightly different levels, giving the child's face an unsettling asymmetry. Ada had delivered children with birth defects before, but never had she seen so many abnormalities in a single infant. She began to ask questions about the mother's health during pregnancy, about any family history of similar conditions, about anything that might explain what she was witnessing. The older man cut her questions short. He paid her the agreed-upon fee, added an additional sum that was far more than necessary, and told her that her services were no longer required. When Ada protested that the infant needed immediate medical attention, that such severe deformities required assessment by a physician, the man's demeanor changed. He reminded her that she had been paid generously for her discretion and that certain families valued their privacy above all else. The birth certificate filed with Harrison County several weeks later listed the child as Emma Whitfield, born to John and Sarah Whitfield, residents of a rural address that later investigation would reveal belonged to a property Amos Creswell had purchased under an assumed name in 1941. The certificate made no mention of any birth defects or abnormalities. Ada Birch, who should have been listed as the attending midwife, was not named on the document. Instead, it bore the signature of a physician Ada had never heard of, a name that would later prove to be entirely fictitious. Ada tried to put the incident out of her mind, but the memory of that deformed infant haunted her. She mentioned it to her husband, a farmer who had little interest in the details of her profession, and he advised her to forget about it. The family had paid her well for her silence, he reasoned, and whatever situation had led to that birth was none of their concern. But Ada could not shake the feeling that something deeply wrong had occurred, that the abnormalities she had witnessed were not merely the result of unfortunate genetics, but of something far more troubling. In the spring of 1942, Ada heard rumors through the network of midwives and rural physicians who occasionally gathered to share knowledge and experiences. Another midwife, a woman named Sarah Cobb who practiced in Woodford County, mentioned being called to attend a birth under circumstances that struck her as suspicious. The infant had been severely deformed. The family had been secretive and hostile to questions, and the payment had been unusually generous. When Ada and Sarah compared their experiences, they found disturbing similarities. Both births had involved young women attended by older male relatives. Both infants had displayed multiple severe abnormalities. Both families had insisted on absolute discretion and had produced falsified documentation. The two women discussed taking their concerns to the county authorities, but both ultimately decided against it. They had no proof of wrongdoing, only suspicions based on medical abnormalities that, while unusual, were not impossible to explain through natural causes. More importantly, they feared the consequences of accusing prominent families of impropriety without evidence. In rural Kentucky during the 1940s, a midwife's reputation depended on her discretion. To break patient confidentiality without irrefutable proof would mean the end of their livelihoods. Dr. Samuel Potter sat in his study on the evening of April 28, 1944, surrounded by medical texts that had not prepared him for what he had witnessed at the Creswell plantation. He had returned home with detailed notes from his examination, and now, in the quiet of his own space, he was attempting to make sense of observations that defied easy explanation. The infant he had examined in Verity's room displayed a constellation of abnormalities that, taken together, suggested a cause far more disturbing than random genetic misfortune. The medical literature of the period contained limited discussion of the genetic consequences of consanguineous reproduction, but what existed was sufficient for a physician of Dr. Potter's experience to recognize the pattern. The facial asymmetry, the cleft palate extending through the upper lip, the compression of one side of the skull, all pointed toward the expression of recessive genetic traits that would only manifest when both parents carried identical harmful genes. The probability of such clustering in a single infant was extraordinarily low in the general population, but became disturbingly common when the parents shared a significant portion of their genetic inheritance. Dr. Potter had not been permitted to conduct a thorough examination of the other two young women he encountered in the locked rooms, but what he observed during his brief time in their presence added to his growing concern. Temperance, the middle daughter, appeared to be in the later stages of pregnancy, perhaps 7 or 8 months along. Her physical condition suggested inadequate prenatal care and poor nutrition. Mercy, the youngest, showed early signs of pregnancy that Dr. Potter estimated at perhaps 3 or 4 months. Both women displayed the same withdrawn demeanor, the same reluctance to speak or make eye contact, the same visible fear when Amos Creswell entered the room. The physician's training compelled him to document what he had seen with clinical precision, but his conscience demanded that he consider the implications of his observations. 3 daughters, all of childbearing age, all confined to locked rooms in their father's house. At least one infant displaying severe congenital abnormalities consistent with close inbreeding. A mother who had died under circumstances that, while officially ruled natural, had never been subjected to thorough investigation. The pattern was undeniable, even if the full truth remained obscured by Amos Creswell's careful control of information. Dr. Potter's notes from that evening, preserved among his papers and later submitted as evidence, reveal his systematic approach to documenting his findings. He described the infant's cranial measurements, noting that the compression of the right side of the skull had resulted in a head circumference well below normal parameters. He detailed the spinal curvature, which began at the base of the neck and created a pronounced deviation from the normal alignment. The limb abnormalities were catalogued with particular attention to the differential leg length and the severe clubfoot deformity that affected both feet. His description of the cleft palate included measurements and observations about the extent of the opening, which would require multiple surgical interventions if the child were to have any hope of normal function. But it was in a separate section of his notes, written in a hand that showed the tremor of strong emotion, that Dr. Potter recorded his suspicions about the cause of these abnormalities. He wrote that, in his 3 decades of medical practice, he had never encountered such a severe clustering of defects in an infant whose parents were unrelated. He noted that the specific combination of cranial, spinal, and facial abnormalities was consistent with what limited medical literature existed on the offspring of incestuous unions. He documented his observation that all 3 young women in the house bore a strong family resemblance to Amos Creswell, and that their ages matched those of the daughters who were supposedly attending school in Virginia. The physician faced a dilemma that the medical ethics of his time did not adequately address. He had been called to provide medical care, but what he had witnessed suggested crimes far beyond his professional jurisdiction. To report his suspicions to the authorities would require him to violate the confidence of patients, or at least of individuals he had examined in a medical capacity. Yet to remain silent would make him complicit in ongoing abuse of the most horrific nature. Dr. Potter spent the night reviewing his notes, consulting his medical texts, and wrestling with a decision that would determine not only his professional future, but potentially the fate of 3 young women trapped in circumstances no human should endure. By the morning of May 2, 1944, Dr. Samuel Potter had made his decision. He arrived at the office of Sheriff Clayton Hayes in Harrodsburg carrying a leather satchel containing his medical notes and a formal written statement detailing what he had observed at the Creswell plantation. Sheriff Hayes, a man in his early 60s who had held his position for nearly 20 years, listened to the physician's account with an expression that shifted from skepticism to alarm as the details accumulated. The sheriff had known Amos Creswell for decades, had accepted without question the story of the daughters attending school in Virginia, had even spoken approvingly of the man's dedication to providing his children with opportunities beyond what rural Kentucky could offer. Now, faced with Dr. Potter's clinical documentation and professional testimony, Hayes found himself confronting the possibility that he and the entire community had been deceived by a man whose crimes exceeded anything the county had encountered in living memory. What followed was a careful process of verification before any action could be taken. Sheriff Hayes contacted the postmaster, Thomas Rigby, and requested records of all correspondence involving the Creswell daughters over the past 3 years. Rigby's initial resistance crumbled when faced with the sheriff's direct questions about the source of the letters supposedly sent from Virginia. Under pressure, the postmaster admitted that he had never actually seen the daughters write any correspondence, that all the letters had been delivered to him by Amos Creswell, already sealed and addressed, and that the monthly payments he received from Creswell had been compensation for handling these letters without question. The telegraph records proved equally damning. When Sheriff Hayes examined the message logs at the Western Union office, he discovered that every telegram supposedly sent by the daughters had been composed and paid for by Amos Creswell himself. The young operator, confronted with this pattern, admitted that he had found it odd at the time, but had assumed there was some reasonable explanation he was not privy to. The deacon at the Methodist Church, when questioned about the letters he claimed to have received from the daughters, eventually confessed that he had never actually possessed such correspondence, that his assurances to the congregation had been based entirely on what Amos had told him, and on his desire to believe that his substantial donation to the church building fund had come from honorable sources. On May 5th, Sheriff Hayes assembled a small group of deputies and traveled to the Creswell plantation with a warrant to search the premises and interview the occupants. Amos Creswell met them at the door with the same cold composure he had shown Dr. Potter days earlier. He denied any wrongdoing, insisted that his daughters were indeed in Virginia, and that the women in his house were distant relatives who had come to him for assistance during difficult pregnancies. When pressed about why these relatives were kept in locked rooms, Amos claimed it was for their own protection, that they were mentally unstable and posed a danger to themselves if left unsupervised. The sheriff ignored these explanations and proceeded with a systematic search of the house. In addition to the 3 young women Dr. Potter had already documented, the deputies discovered evidence of 2 other infants on the property. One was the severely deformed child that had been in Verity's room, now barely clinging to life despite being nearly 6 months old. The infant's condition had deteriorated significantly since Dr. Potter's examination, and it was clear that without immediate medical intervention, the child would not survive much longer. The second infant was found in a makeshift nursery in the basement, a boy approximately 18 months old who displayed a different but equally severe set of abnormalities. The child's face bore the unmistakable signs of cleft palate, but more disturbing were the skeletal deformities that had left him unable to sit upright or support his own weight. The interviews with the daughters were conducted separately, each woman questioned in a room away from Amos's presence. Verity, the eldest, was the most coherent in her responses, though her testimony came in fragments punctuated by long silences and visible distress. She confirmed that she and her sisters had never left the plantation after their mother's death, that the letters and telegrams had been fabrications created by their father, and that the children were indeed the result of his repeated assaults over a period of years. Temperance and Mercy provided similar accounts, though both were less able to articulate the full scope of what had occurred, their voices barely rising above whispers as they described years of confinement and abuse. Sheriff Hayes arrested Amos Creswell that evening on charges of unlawful imprisonment, assault, and contributing to the delinquency of minors. The formal murder charge related to Parthenia's death would come later, after the sealed envelope she had left with the county clerk was finally opened and its contents revealed. As deputies led Amos from his house in handcuffs, He maintained the same expression of cold indifference that had characterized his demeanor throughout the investigation. He spoke only once during the arrest, telling the sheriff that he had done nothing any man with authority over his household would not have done, that his daughters belonged to him as surely as the land and the livestock, and that the law had no right to interfere in family matters. The sealed envelope that Parthenia Creswell had left with County Clerk Robert Finch in September of 1940 remained undisturbed in its locked drawer until Sheriff Hayes requested access to any documents that might relate to the Creswell family. Finch, whose meticulous record-keeping had preserved a notation about the envelope's existence, retrieved it on the afternoon of May 7, 1944. The envelope bore Parthenia's name written in her own hand, along with instructions that it should only be opened in the event of suspicious circumstances surrounding her death. Sheriff Hayes broke the seal in the presence of two witnesses, Dr. Potter and the county prosecutor, James Harland. Inside were 3 pages of closely written script dated September 22, 1940, less than a month before Parthenia's death. The letter began with a statement of sound mind and clear purpose. Parthenia's assertion that what she was about to reveal came from direct observation and genuine fear for her daughter's safety. What followed was an account that transformed the investigation from a case of abuse into one of premeditated murder. Parthenia wrote that she had begun to suspect her husband of poisoning her in late August of 1940. The symptoms had started gradually, persistent stomach pains that she initially attributed to anxiety and stress. But as the weeks progressed, the pain intensified and was accompanied by episodes of violent nausea, unexplained weakness, and a metallic taste in her mouth that she could not rid herself of no matter what she ate or drank. She had mentioned these symptoms to Amos, who had responded with unusual attentiveness, preparing her meals himself and insisting she take regular doses of a tonic he claimed would settle her stomach. The letter detailed Parthenia's growing realization that the tonic itself might be the source of her illness. She described discovering a bottle hidden in Amos's study, a container labeled as livestock medicine but containing a white powder that she did not recognize. When she confronted him about it, asking what purpose such a substance served, Amos had explained it was arsenic-based rat poison, necessary for controlling vermin in the grain stores. But Parthenia had begun to notice that her symptoms worsened after taking the tonic Amos prepared, and that the few occasions when she had been too ill to consume it brought temporary relief from the most severe pains. Most damning were Parthenia's observations about Amos's intentions toward their daughters. She wrote that his behavior had progressed beyond inappropriate attention to open declarations of his plans for them. In an argument that occurred just days before she composed the letter, Amos had told her directly that once she was gone, the daughters would fulfill the role she no longer could. When Parthenia expressed horror at this statement, Amos had responded with cold logic. The daughters were his property, he told her, born of his seed and raised under his authority. What he chose to do with them was no concern of the law or of moral convention that applied to lesser men. The plantation was his kingdom, and within its boundaries, his will was absolute. Parthenia's letter concluded with a plea that if anything should happen to her, if she should die suddenly or under circumstances that seemed even remotely suspicious, the authorities must protect her daughters from their father. She begged that her body be examined properly, that a real physician conduct an autopsy rather than simply accepting whatever explanation Amos provided. She expressed regret that she had not acted sooner, that her fear of her husband had paralyzed her for too long. Her final paragraph was addressed to her daughters directly, telling them that she had tried to save them, that her failure was not from lack of love but from lack of courage, and that she prayed someone would eventually uncover the truth she was leaving behind. The letter provided the legal foundation for what came next. On May 8th, Sheriff Hayes obtained a court order for the exhumation of Parthenia Creswell's body. The process took place on a gray morning under the supervision of Dr. Potter and a forensic specialist brought in from Lexington, Dr. Howard Bennett. The grave in the family cemetery yielded its secrets reluctantly, the coffin showing signs of the years it had spent beneath the Kentucky soil. But the body itself, preserved to some degree by the cool, dry conditions of the burial site, was sufficient for the examination that followed. Dr. Bennett's autopsy took most of the day and extended into the evening hours. He worked methodically, taking tissue samples from the liver, kidneys, stomach lining, and bone marrow. These samples were subjected to chemical analysis using the Marsh test, a procedure that could detect the presence of arsenic even years after death. The results were unambiguous. Parthenia Creswell's tissues contained arsenic concentrations far exceeding any level that could be explained by environmental exposure. The pattern of distribution, with the highest concentrations in the digestive organs and bone tissue, was consistent with repeated ingestion over a period of weeks or months. The official report filed with the county prosecutor on May 10th concluded that Parthenia Creswell had died as a result of chronic arsenic poisoning, administered in doses calculated to simulate natural illness while gradually destroying her internal organs. The original death certificate, which had listed heart failure as the cause, was amended to reflect homicide by poisoning. The charge of murder was formally added to the case against Amos Creswell, and the prosecutor began preparing for what would become one of the most closely watched trials in Kentucky history. The trial of Amos Creswell began on July 10, 1944, in the Circuit Court of Mercer County. The courthouse, a brick building that had stood since the 1870s, had never seen such crowds. People traveled from across the state to witness proceedings that newspapers were calling the most disturbing criminal case in Kentucky history. Judge William Thornton, no relation to the fictional Creswell name, presided over a courtroom packed with spectators, journalists, and citizens who could scarcely believe that such horrors had unfolded in their midst for years without detection. The prosecution, led by James Harlan, built its case methodically. Dr. Potter testified about his examination of the deformed infants and his medical conclusion that the abnormalities were consistent with consanguineous reproduction. Dr. Bennett presented the forensic evidence of arsenic poisoning, displaying tissue samples and chemical analysis reports that left no doubt about the cause of Parthenia's death. The daughters themselves took the stand, their testimony delivered in halting voices that barely carried to the back of the courtroom. Verity described years of confinement following their mother's death, the systematic abuse that had begun within months of Parthenia's burial, and the births of children she had been forced to deliver in locked rooms with no medical assistance beyond what her father chose to provide. Amos Creswell's defense attorney, a lawyer from Lexington named Douglas Pritchard, attempted to argue that his client was a man of his time, that the standards being applied to him reflected modern sensibilities rather than the values of rural Kentucky in the early 20th century. The argument found no purchase with the jury. The evidence was overwhelming, the crime too monstrous to be excused by appeals to historical context or patriarchal authority. On August 3rd, after deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges: murder in the first degree for the death of Parthenia Creswell, 3 counts of rape, 3 counts of incest, and multiple counts of child endangerment related to the infants born of his assaults on his daughters. Judge Thornton sentenced Amos Creswell to death by hanging, a sentence carried out on November 17, 1944, at the state penitentiary in Eddyville. Newspaper accounts of the execution noted that Creswell maintained his composure to the end, offering no final statement and showing no sign of remorse for the suffering he had inflicted. The fate of the daughters and their children proved more complicated than the straightforward justice delivered to their father. Verity, Temperance, and Mercy were placed temporarily in the care of the county until arrangements could be made for their futures. All 3 women, now in their early to mid-20s, faced the challenge of rebuilding lives that had been stolen from them. Verity eventually went to live with Parthenia's sister in a neighboring county, where she worked in a seamstress shop and lived quietly until her death from pneumonia in 1953. Temperance was accepted into a charitable home for women in Louisville, where she learned basic secretarial skills and found employment with a manufacturing company. She married in 1948 and bore 2 healthy children, though she never spoke publicly about her ordeal. Mercy, the youngest, struggled most severely with the psychological aftermath of her captivity. She spent several years in a psychiatric facility before being released to the care of a religious order that operated a farm for women recovering from trauma. The 3 deformed children presented medical and ethical dilemmas that the community was ill-equipped to address. The infant girl that Dr. Potter had first examined died in June of 1944, her multiple abnormalities proving incompatible with life despite the best efforts of physicians at the county hospital. The 18-month-old boy, whose skeletal deformities and cleft palate had left him unable to thrive, was placed in a state institution for children with severe disabilities. Records show he survived until 1949, though he never developed the ability to walk or speak. The 3rd child, born to Temperance in late May of 1944 during the investigation, displayed less severe abnormalities than his siblings. He had a cleft palate that was surgically repaired over a series of operations and minor developmental delays that improved with proper care. This child was eventually adopted by a family in Indiana who had been informed of his background and chose to raise him despite the challenges he presented. The Creswell plantation itself was seized by the county to pay legal costs and restitution to the daughters. The property was auctioned in 1945, purchased by a farming cooperative that demolished the main house and converted the land to more productive use. The family cemetery where Parthenia had been buried was left undisturbed, though Amos Creswell's body was not interred there after his execution. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, his name deliberately excluded from any permanent record. The case prompted changes in how Kentucky law enforcement handled reports of family disturbances and domestic situations. Sheriff Hayes, though not formally censured, retired shortly after the trial, his reputation permanently marked by his failure to investigate earlier. The postmaster, Thomas Rigby, lost his position and faced charges of obstruction of justice, though these were eventually dropped in exchange for his testimony. Deacon Webb resigned from his position at the church. The building fund donation that had bought his silence returned to the county and used to establish a fund for victims of family violence. The story of the Creswell family became a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation, the abuse of patriarchal authority, and the consequences of a community's willingness to look away from uncomfortable truths. In the decades that followed, historians and sociologists would study the case as an example of how systems designed to protect the vulnerable could fail when those systems relied too heavily on the discretion of individuals who valued social harmony over justice. The sealed letter Parthenia left behind became a symbol of the importance of believing women who reported abuse, of taking seriously the warnings that too often went unheeded until tragedy had already occurred. If this story has moved you, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to this channel. The truth, no matter how painful, deserves to be remembered. Tomorrow we will uncover another story that history tried to bury. These voices from the past need to be heard, and your support helps us continue bringing these forgotten stories to light.